This is Ranger Davis! They are out of their cages! Do not let them escape!
Every mountain range in the Appalachians keeps its own list. The things the Park Service doesn't put on brochures. The encounters that get filed as animal attacks because there's no box on the form for what actually happened. These are 4 more of those files. 4 rangers, 4 different ranges, 4 things that were never supposed to be real. This is Terrifying Park Ranger Encounters in the Appalachian Mountains. Story 1. The Spearfinger of Nantahala Gorge. Ranger Colton Briggs had grown up hearing his grandmother's stories about Spearfinger. Utlunta, she called it in the old language, the stone-skinned woman who could wear any face she chose and carried a single finger honed to a killing point, used to stab a person through the ribs and take the liver before they'd even finished falling. His grandmother had always been careful to tell it as a story of caution, not spectacle, a warning about trusting a stranger too quickly on a lonely trail, dressed up in the shape of something older than memory. Briggs had carried that respect into the job and never once expected to need it. The first disappearance was a solo backpacker who'd texted her sister from the Nantahala Gorge overlook saying she'd run into another hiker, an older woman, kind-looking, who'd offered to show her a shortcut down to the river. She never made the shortcut. Her pack was found 3 days later, 40 yards off any marked trail, with a single puncture wound through the fabric so precise it looked almost surgical. Briggs brought a volunteer named Ruth Sequoia, a Cherokee elder from the nearby community who'd offered to help the moment she heard the details, her face going tight and grim in a way that told Briggs she already suspected exactly what they were dealing with. "She doesn't attack strangers who are wary," Ruth told him as they picked their way down toward the river gorge. "She finds someone alone, and she becomes whoever that person is least likely to be afraid of. A kind grandmother, a lost hiker who needs help, someone with a good, trustworthy face. That's how she gets close enough to use the finger." They found the backpacker's body wedged in a rock crevice above the river, and the wound was exactly what Ruth had described. A single narrow puncture beneath the ribs, precise enough to have been done with surgical instruments, though nothing recovered at the scene explained how. Briggs was still crouched over the body when Ruth grabbed his arm hard enough to bruise, staring past him up the trail. An older woman stood there, gray-haired, dressed plainly, smiling with an expression of pure grandmotherly concern that made every hair on Briggs's arm stand up before his mind caught up with his instincts. "You boys look like you could use some help finding your way," she said, in a voice as warm and ordinary as any stranger's on any trail in the world. "Don't look at her hands," Ruth said, low and fast. "Whatever you do, don't let her get close enough to touch you." The woman's smile didn't change, but something in her posture did. A stillness, a patience that no genuinely lost hiker would have. Briggs raised his flashlight instead of his weapon, some instinct telling him light mattered more here than a bullet, and in the sudden harsh beam her skin, for just a fraction of a second, showed the unmistakable dull gray texture of stone beneath the illusion of soft, wrinkled human skin. She came at Ruth first, faster than anything her apparent age should have allowed, one hand already extending into a single, impossibly long, tapering point where an index finger should have been. Ruth threw herself sideways, and the strike that would have taken her through the ribs instead tore a 6-inch gouge through her jacket and the flesh beneath it, and Briggs, screaming, emptied his sidearm into the woman's chest at point-blank range. The rounds did nothing but chip stone. She turned that same gentle, grandmotherly smile on him next, and Briggs understood with total clarity that he had perhaps 4 seconds left to live before Ruth, bleeding heavily but conscious, screamed a single word at him in Cherokee and hurled her water bottle full directly into the creature's face. It shrieked, a sound with nothing human left in it at all, and staggered back, and Ruth, gasping, told Briggs later what she'd remembered in that instant. The old story said water, especially moving water, especially river water blessed in the old way, was one of the only things that could hurt what was essentially a creature of dry stone and older magic. She hadn't had time to bless it. She'd thrown it anyway, on pure desperate instinct, and it had been enough to buy them the seconds they needed to reach the truck. They didn't find the creature again that night. The backpacker's death was filed as an animal attack, species unconfirmed. Ruth Sequoia survived, carrying a scar along her ribs she now shows to exactly no one. and Briggs has never patrolled the gorge alone since and never will again. Story 2. The Devil Monkey of the Roan Highlands. Ranger Simone Delacroix had fielded plenty of strange wildlife reports in her time on the Cherokee National Forest, but nothing quite like the string of calls that came in over 2 weeks in late September. A hiker's dog dragged screaming into brush and never recovered. Livestock at a ridge edge farm found torn apart in ways too violent for any coyote, and a hunter's trail camera capturing, for less than a second, a shape crossing a clearing on 2 legs with a bounding kangaroo-like gait that made Delacroix's stomach drop the first time she reviewed the footage. She brought a volunteer named Hollis Tarpley, a longtime hunting guide who'd worked these highlands for 30 years and had his own private theory, half joking until it wasn't, about something the old-timers called the devil monkey. An aggressive, baboon-faced creature that moved on powerful hind legs, attacked livestock and pets with startling ferocity, and had a scream, Hollis said, that once heard was never mistaken for anything else on this mountain. Heard it myself once 20 years back, Hollis told her, checking his rifle at the trailhead. Never told anybody because I didn't want to sound like a fool, but I've never doubted for 1 second that whatever I heard that night was real. They found the missing dog's collar wedged in the fork of a rhododendron thicket, and beyond it, a game trail churned with prints unlike anything either of them had documented. Broad, 3-toed, spaced in long bounding strides that suggested something covering serious ground on 2 legs alone. The scream came at dusk, exactly as Hollis had described it, a sound that started like a woman's shriek and rose into something with a rasping, animal edge that no human throat could have produced. It hit them from the thicket at a dead run, low to the ground on all 4s before rising onto its hind legs for the final lunge. Roughly the size of a large man but built wrong, matted brown-black fur, a flattened baboon-like face split by an enormous mouth full of teeth clearly meant for tearing rather than chewing, 4 limbs ending in long-fingered hands tipped with hooked claws. Hollis got 1 shot off before it was on him, and the sound that followed has stayed with Delacroix in a way she has never been able to fully articulate in any official statement. Not quite an animal sound, not quite anything else. Simply violence happening very close and very fast. She fired everything she had into it as it dragged Hollis backward into the thicket, and it released him, screaming, and retreated far enough for her to reach him, though not far enough in the end to matter. Hollis Tarpley died before the helicopter reached them. His death is on record as a bear attack. Delacroix has requested every season since that the Roan Highlands stretch of trail carry an unofficial advisory about aggressive wildlife that she has never once been asked to elaborate on and has never once volunteered to. Story 3. The Snarly Yow of Turner's Gap. Ranger Harlan Prescott had walked the Appalachian Trail corridor through Turner's Gap more times than he could count without giving the old South Mountain legend a second thought. The Snarly Yow, a phantom black dog said to haunt the Gap since before the Civil War, an omen that appeared to travelers just before something terrible happened to them. He'd always assumed it was a story invented to keep children off the ridge after dark. He stopped assuming that the week a through hiker went missing from a shelter near the Gap, leaving behind a journal whose final legible entry described in increasingly frantic handwriting a massive black dog with eyes that held light wrong, pacing the tree line every night for 3 nights running, growing closer each time. Prescott brought a volunteer, a Civil War historian named Dorothy Vance, who'd spent years documenting South Mountain's older folklore and had her own theory that the Gap's history, a brutal battle fought across this exact ridge in 1862, had left something behind that fed in some fashion neither of them could fully explain on fear itself. Every account agrees on one thing, Dorothy told him as they hiked toward the shelter under a sky already going the color of a fresh bruise. It doesn't attack right away. It shows itself first. Lets you see it. Lets the fear build. The people who survived an encounter were always the ones who managed not to run. They found the through hiker's boots at the shelter, neatly placed side by side, and nothing else. Prescott was still crouched over them when Dorothy went rigid, staring past his shoulder toward the tree line, where something enormous stood watching them with an absolute, unnatural stillness. A dog's shape, easily the size of a small horse, coal black, its eyes holding a faint inner luminescence that caught no light from Prescott's headlamp and seemed, instead, to generate its own. It didn't move for nearly a full minute. Dorothy, breathing hard but steady, gripped Prescott's arm and told him low and urgent not to run, not yet, that the stories were consistent on this one point above all others. Prescott held his ground through the longest silence of his life, and the creature eventually simply faded backward into the tree line the way smoke dissipates rather than walking away, and was gone. They should have left then. Instead, driven by the same protocol-bound instinct that had cost other rangers their volunteers before him, Prescott pushed on toward the ridge where the thru-hiker's journal described the sightings intensifying. And it was there, in full dark, that the creature returned. Closer this time, faster, and Dorothy, despite every warning she'd given him, broke and ran the instant it charged. Prescott heard what happened to her without seeing it clearly, and has never fully forgiven himself for the fact that his own legs, frozen in place exactly as the old stories advised, were the only reason he survived that ridge at all. The creature circled him once, close enough that its breath fogged in the cold air an inch from his face, and then, with no explanation he has ever been able to offer, it simply left. Dorothy Vance's remains were recovered the next morning. Turner's Gap remains open to Appalachian trail through hikers, with a small brass plaque near the shelter commemorating a battle nobody visiting today thinks twice about. And Prescott has never once explained to a hiker asking about local history why he always adds, at the end of his usual account, a quiet suggestion not to run if they ever see something large and dark watching them from the trees. Story 4. The Raven Mocker of Chattahoochee Ridge. Ranger Talia Okafor had never given much thought to the old Cherokee stories about the Raven Mocker, a witch spirit said to hunt the dying, stealing the years a person had left to live and adding them, stolen, to its own unnaturally extended life. Her grandmother, who carried Cherokee ancestry through her father's line, had always told it as a story about respecting the dying and the grief around them, not a monster story, something you were meant to protect the sick from, not merely fear. She started taking it seriously the week an elderly hiker, terminally ill, and hiking a section of trail he'd loved his whole life as what his family openly called a final farewell trip, vanished from his campsite overnight, leaving behind a scene that made no sense. His tent undisturbed, no sign of struggle, but a heavy, unmistakable smell of ash and ozone lingering over the whole site, and a scorch pattern on the ground outside shaped disturbingly like enormous wings. Okafor brought a volunteer, a hospice nurse named Faith Underwood, who'd worked with the missing hiker's family, and had her own quiet unease about what she'd witnessed in his final weeks. A growing, irrational fear he wouldn't fully explain, of being watched at night by something that sounded like a raven learning to talk. The old stories say it comes for people who are close to dying, Faith told Okafor as they searched the site by flashlight. It can smell it on you, they say. And it doesn't just kill you, it takes what's left, steals your remaining years like currency. They heard it before they saw it. A harsh, guttural, croaking cry, unmistakably corvid in origin but layered underneath with something that resembled, horribly, a human voice trying and failing to form words. A shape dropped out of the canopy ahead of them in a burst of black feathers and trailing sparks, resolving on the ground into something roughly humanoid, gaunt, wrapped in a cloak of what might have been feathers, or might have been something the eye simply refused to fully process, its face a shifting blur between an old woman's features and a raven's hooked beak. It came for Faith first, whether by chance or because it sensed the years of grief and secondhand exposure to death she carried from her work. Okafor has never been able to decide, closing the distance in a burst of unnatural speed, and Faith screamed a single word, in a language Okafor didn't recognize until much later as the beginning of an old Cherokee protective phrase her own grandmother had once used, before the creature's clawed hand closed around her chest, and Okafor watched, powerless, as something visibly, impossibly left Faith's body in a thin trail of light drawn directly into the creature's open mouth. Faith collapsed, alive but aged, decades of unlived years stripped from her in the space of a single breath. Her hair gone white, her hands trembling with a frailty that hadn't existed 30 seconds earlier. The creature let out a satisfied shriek and rose back into the canopy on wings that caught no branches, trailing sparks that hissed out against the wet leaves below, and was simply gone. Faith Underwood survived, technically, though the hospice where she'd once worked now treats her as a patient rather than a colleague. Her body decades older than her chart's date of birth can account for. The missing hiker was never found. Okafor still works the Chattahoochee Ridge trails and has developed, without ever fully explaining why to her supervisors, a quiet personal policy of never patrolling alone near any camper she knows to be seriously ill. Nantahala Gorge, the Roan Highlands, Turner's Gap, and the Chattahoochee Ridge trails remain open to the public, each carrying warnings whose real justification has never made it into any official file. Hollis Tarpley and Dorothy Vance were laid to rest by their families. Ruth Sequoia and Faith Underwood both survived, carrying scars neither has fully explained to anyone outside this case file. If something's ever watched you from the tree line on an Appalachian trail, the comments are open. We read everyone. Subscribe for the next case file. Some of them, we're only now getting permission to tell.